I have kept records for 31 years. That is not a boast. It is a statement of duration, of accumulated ink and digital inscription, and the particular kind of fatigue that settles behind your eyes when you have transcribed enough history to know that most of it is not history at all. It is bookkeeping. Commission sessions, treaty annexes, species dossiers, arbitration minutes, roll calls, procedural motions, points of order, amendments to amendments. I have logged them all in the exact language the Joint Treaty Commission requires, which is to say the language of institutional certainty. Every claim documented, every claim traceable, every entity in this galaxy given a file, a category, a record of standing, and a notation of what the Commission understood them to be. That last part is where it went wrong. I should be precise about my role before I describe what happened in the final weeks of the Vareth Accord negotiations, because my role is the reason I was positioned to see it at all. I was, a commission clerk of the Third Register, which is the rank below the senior scribes, who sit at the main table, and 2 ranks below the chronicler, who sits beside the chair, and whose records are considered canonical. My station was the secondary transcription post, a low lectern against the chamber's east wall, far enough from the dais that the senior delegates rarely looked in my direction, and close enough to the floor that I could observe the room in full without drawing attention. I recorded everything the primary microphones captured. I also recorded, in the margin columns that were my own professional habit, what the microphones did not capture: the direction of a gaze, the quality of a silence, the moment a chair shifted or a set of fingers went still. After what happened, some of my colleagues said that I embellished my margin notes. I want to address that now, plainly, so we can move on. I did not embellish anything. I am a clerk. Embellishment is a breach of registry oath, and I have held that oath for 31 years without a finding against me. What I recorded in those margins was what I observed. If it reads like something more dramatic than a routine session, that's because it was something more dramatic than a routine session, and the Commission's institutional habit of treating every crisis as a procedural inconvenience does not change what those days contained. I will start where any honest account must start, the archive. But before the archive, a word about the Commission itself, because the Commission is an institution that rewards context. The Joint Treaty Commission is not a government. It does not govern anything in the direct sense of that word. What it does is arbitrate, mediate, and ratify. It takes the disputes and the negotiations and the treaties of 41 signatory species and applies a procedural architecture so that none of them have to resolve those things at the point of a weapon if they can avoid it. This is a genuine service. It has prevented a meaningful number of wars over the century and a half of its formal operation, and the species that have benefited from it are genuinely grateful, even when they are simultaneously frustrated by the Commission's institutional habits. The habits are real. They have been documented. The most significant one, the one that shaped everything I am about to describe, is this. The Commission believes in classification. It believes, at an almost philosophical level, that a correctly classified entity is a manageable entity, and that a manageable entity is a safe entity, and that a safe entity can be accommodated within the procedural architecture without disruption. Classification is not merely administrative to the Commission. It is a form of confidence. When the Commission knows what a species is, it knows how to handle that species, and the handling is always, in some way, a form of arrangement. What they can be offered, what they can be pressured with, where they can be moved to, what they can be expected to accept. This is not cynical, or not entirely. It is simply the logic of an institution that has processed 41 species across a very long time, and has found that categorization, done well, reduces friction. The Commission would say it is a service. The Commission would not be entirely wrong. The problem, as any logician will tell you, is that classification systems are only as accurate as the information used to build them, and information is only as accurate as the honesty of its sources. The Commission is quite good at independent verification. It has intelligence bodies and technical analysts and long-established sensor networks and all the apparatus of an organization that has been watching the galaxy for 150 years. None of that is nothing. Most of the time it is enough. I have been thinking about that word. Enough for a long time. The Commission maintains a species archive. It is the oldest continuous institutional record in what we formally call the treaty space, which is the combined jurisdictional reach of the 41 signatory species. Every species that has ever applied for recognition, a treaty body, sought arbitration, or been discussed in formal session has an archive entry. The entry contains biological taxonomy, homeworld coordinates, population estimates, observed military capacity rated on the Commission's 7-tier index, cultural behavioral notes, and, most critically, a standing classification. Standing classifications run from provisional observer through associate member through full, signatory, and above those formal tiers, there are informal notations that the Commission uses internally but does not publish. Contained, watched, dormant, and the one that was almost never assigned, the one I had only ever seen in historical files for species that no longer existed, the notation written in Old Commission shorthand as a single character that translates roughly as unknown quantity. I had never, in 31 years, seen unknown quantity assigned to a living species. Humanity's archive entry had been through 11 revisions before I was ever assigned to Commission service. I know this because I looked it up when the Verith negotiations were first calendared, and the human delegation was listed as a of record. 11 revisions is extraordinary. Most species are revised twice, once upon initial contact, once after their first full treaty engagement, and then the file stabilizes because the Commission has formed its institutional opinion, and institutional opinions, once formed, are remarkably durable. 11 revisions in the human file suggested either that humanity kept doing things the Commission had not anticipated, or that whoever was maintaining the file kept writing things down, then going back to change them, because what they had written made the Commission look uninformed. In retrospect, I believe it was both. The entry I read during my pre-session preparation described humans as a Category 3 military power, significant but not dominant, capable of sustained conflict at the regional scale, unlikely to project force at the galactic scale without substantial coalition support. It noted a tendency toward factional behavior and internal disagreement that the Commission had, in past sessions, successfully leveraged to extract concessions. It classified their diplomatic posture as reactive. Humans negotiated when pressed and conceded when threatened with isolation. The standing classification was full signatory with a secondary notation of managed. Managed, that was the word. I wrote it in my own notes during preparation because it struck me as precise and honest in the way that institutional language occasionally achieves precision and honesty by accident. The Commission had decided that humans were a species that could be managed, and it had built 30 years of policy on that assessment, and the Verith Accord was, in all practical terms, a formalization of that management. The Verith system is mineral-rich and strategically positioned at the junction of 3 transit corridors that matter to a dozen species, including humanity. A previous treaty had allocated the corridors under a joint-use framework that nobody was entirely happy with, but that had held without major incident for 16 years. The new accord was supposed to replace that framework with a cleaner arrangement. Cleaner meaning, as is almost always the case when the Commission uses that word, an arrangement that was cleaner for the species who held the most seats on the WAN arbitration panel. The humans were to receive 1 transit corridor outright, cede access rights to a second, and accept monitoring protocols on their vessel movements through the third. In exchange, they would receive a modest increase in Commission voting weight from 4 votes to 5 on matters related to the Verith sector. That was the deal on the table. 4 months of preliminary sessions had moved it from draft to near final, with the human delegation offering what the Commission's senior strategist described. In internal memos I was not supposed to read, but transcribed by standing mandate, as predictable friction followed by acceptable concession. The human lead negotiator, a woman named Cassidy Reeve, a career diplomat in her 60s with gray-streaked hair that she wore pulled back and an expression that I later came to understand was not, in fact, neutral, had asked pointed questions, objected to 3 specific clauses, on grounds that the Commission's legal counsel had addressed with confidence, and then accepted modified language that the Commission considered substantively equivalent to the original. Standard management. I should say something about those 4 months of preliminary sessions, because they are relevant to one understanding what happened in the final session, and because I was present for them. My assignment to the Vareth proceedings extended to the full negotiation period, not only the final sessions, and so I had accumulated 4 months of margin notes on Reeve by the time she walked into the chamber that last day. She was thorough. That is the word I would have used if asked in those preliminary months to characterize her. Thorough in the way of someone who has prepared completely and intends to make use of the preparation. Who asks about clause language not because they find it unclear, but because they want the record to contain the other side's interpretation of it. She never asked a question she did not already know the answer to. This is not an assessment I am making in retrospect. I noted it in my margins after the third preliminary session because it was observable as a consistent pattern. She would ask, the Commission's counsel would answer, and Reeve would nod. In the particular way of a person who has received a confirmation rather than information. I noted it. I did not know what to do with the notation. It was not unusual behavior for a senior negotiator exactly. What was unusual was the consistency of it. The sense that every question was part of an accounting that was being kept somewhere I could not see. I am a clerk, not an analyst, and I recorded what I observed and moved on. Okafor, her deputy, spoke less than she did and wrote more. Had a personal notebook of his own, actual paper like mine, and he wrote in it throughout every session with a focus that suggested he was transcribing something that interested him considerably. I watched him write and wondered what he was capturing that my own recording array was not. The technical advisor, I should note, was not present in the preliminary sessions. He appeared only at the final session, which I did not think about until afterward. The final session was scheduled to run 2 days. Day 1 for the formal review of the near-final text, 2 for signing. I arrived early on day 1 as I always do, and set my station in order. I calibrated the secondary recording array, tested the backup systems. I laid out my ledger, actual physical paper, which is an affectation the Commission tolerates in clerks, because it has occasionally proven useful when digital systems fail, and I dated the opening page. I noted the chamber configuration, the Commission's arbitration panel at the raised dais. 12 seats, 9 filled that morning. Treaty table below the dais, long and rectangular, 16 seats, with the Vareth system's primary stakeholder delegations assigned to specific positions by the seating protocol, and the human delegation at the far end of the table, 4 seats, currently empty because Reeve's team was never early. They arrived together, 3 of them, at the exact scheduled time. Reeve, deputy, a younger man named Okafor, whom I had catalogued as methodical and quiet, and a third I did not recognize from the prior sessions. The Commission's manifest listed the third as a technical advisor, which was a category that could mean almost anything, and I noted the designation without attaching significance to it. People rotate in and out of delegations. It is common. What was not common was what the technical advisor was carrying. It was a case. Matte black, roughly the dimensions of a modest document archive, with a handle and a set of physical clasps that I had not seen on a diplomatic case before. Older hardware, by the look of it, the kind of mechanical latch that predated electronic sealing. He set it on the table in front of the empty chair, beside Reeve's position, and did not open it. He sat down. He placed both hands on the table. He looked at the dais with an expression I could not immediately classify, which is not something I say often. The session opened on schedule. The chair, arbitrator Velhen, a senior figure I had served under for 9 years, ran the opening procedures with the efficiency he had refined over decades. Roll call. Confirmation of quorum. Formal notation that the near-final text had been distributed and reviewed. Invitation to the parties to raise any remaining procedural matters before the substantive review commenced. Delegations of the 4 Vareth-adjacent species offered nothing. Their positions had been fully negotiated. The Kareth Compact representative, who had a secondary interest in the third corridor, noted satisfaction with the monitoring protocol language. The Commission's own senior counsel confirmed that all prior objections had been addressed in the current draft. Velen turned to the human delegation. Standard procedure. The delegation of humanity, any preliminary matters. Reeve looked at her deputy. Something passed between them that I cannot quantify. A look, a slight tilt of the head. And then she looked back at the chair and said, "One matter, arbitrator. We'd like to introduce a document into the record before the review begins." Velhen acknowledged the request. Also standard. Delegations introduce supporting documents regularly. The Commission's records staff would log it, assign a docket number, and it would be referenced if relevant. The technical advisor opened the case. "I am describing what I observed, and I want to be methodical about it, because the manner in which the subsequent hours unfolded has been discussed extensively in Commission in internal review, and I would rather the account I provide be mine, in my words, from my position at the secondary lectern, than a summary of a summary. What the case contained was paper, a very great deal of paper, organized in bound volumes, that the technical advisor began placing on the table with a deliberate efficiency that suggested the placement had been planned. He did not stack them. He laid them end to end along the table's surface. And when the space immediately in front of the human delegation was covered, he continued along the length of the table into the space normally occupied by other delegations, and the delegations shifted their materials to accommodate him, because the Commission's rules of procedure require parties to yield table space to documents being formally introduced, and no one had anticipated that the rule would need to apply at this scale. There were 43 volumes. Counted. The technical advisor sat back down. Reeve folded her hands. Velen looked at the documents. He looked at Reeve. "Can you characterize the material for the record?" "It's our archive entry," Reeve said. "The full version." The room did not react immediately, which is itself a thing worth recording. Rooms that are about to react significantly often go very still first, as though all the available energy is being collected before it is released. That is what happened in the 6 seconds after Reeve spoke. Then Velhen's senior counsel leaned toward him, and Velhen leaned toward her, and I could see from my station that he was speaking in a low register that the microphones did not capture. I noted in my margins, "Chair confers privately with counsel." Duration, approximately 20 seconds. Chair's expression during conference, a quality that, in my professional terminology, I would record as reassessment. "The Commission maintains humanity's archive entry," Velhen said when he straightened. His voice was composed, which I credit to his experience. "I'm not certain what you mean by the full version. The entry in your active files is 11 revisions old," Reeve said. "Each revision was made after a Commission assessment of human capacity and intent. Each revision was based on the information humanity provided at the time, and on whatever independent analysis your intelligence bodies conducted. We have no objection to that process. You're entitled to form your own assessments. But the entry in your files is incomplete, and we thought it would be useful to have a complete record on the table before we finalized a treaty that is, in material terms, premised on that entry." Velhen was quiet. "Incomplete in what sense?" Reeve nodded to the technical advisor, opened the first volume, and read aloud a single entry header. "I will not reproduce it in full, because some of it remains under Commission sensitivity classification. But the substance was this. The first volume documented human military production capacity across a continuous 17-year period, not at the level the Commission's file described, but at a level approximately 3 times that figure, sustained and apparently growing." The technical advisor read the header entry only, 1 paragraph, 8 sentences, and then he closed the volume and set it flat. The second volume, he told the room, concerned human research and development in propulsion technology across the same period. He read the header. The Commission's assessment in the active file had rated human propulsion development as incremental. The second volume's summary used a different word. Several different words, in fact, but the one that made Velhen's counsel put her stylus down flat on the table in front of her was generational. The third volume was mineral extraction. The fourth was population distribution and civil integration of frontier systems. The fifth was logistics infrastructure. The 6th through 9th were energy production by sector. He did not read all 43 headers. He read 12. I have thought a great deal in the years since about the decision to read only 12 of 43. It was, I believe, a demonstration of precision. 12 was enough to establish the pattern. The other 31 sat on the table and said nothing, which was a form of saying everything. Velhen called a recess at the 90-minute mark. He did not offer a duration. The Commission's internal protocol for unscheduled recesses allows the chair to call one at any point in a session when, in his judgment, additional preparation is required by any party. In 31 years of Commission service, I had seen the HFY protocol invoked 7 times. I had never seen it invoked in what was supposed to be a final review session. During the recess, I remained at my station as required, and I observed. The human delegation did not move from their seats. Reeve spoke quietly with Okafor. The technical advisor drank water and looked at the volumes arranged along the table with an expression I could only describe as professional satisfaction, the expression of a person who has prepared it carefully and found that the preparation was correct. The other delegations clustered at various points in the chamber and spoke in the low registers that are acoustically invisible from my lectern. The commission panel withdrew to the anteroom behind the dais. All 9 of them. That had never happened in my time at that post. They were gone for 40 minutes. I sat at my lectern and counted the volumes from a distance. 43. Each one perhaps 300 pages, perhaps more. I was judging by the spine width, which is an imprecise method. The first volume's subject was military production, a 12,000-page archive of things the Commission had not known, or had not incorporated. The distinction matters, and I was already beginning to understand that I would spend years working out which it was. I looked at Reeve. She was not looking at the volumes. She was looking at the far wall of the chamber, which contains the Commission's founding inscription in 14 languages. The official languages of the 14 founding species, of which humanity is not one, because humanity was not a founding member. She had faced that wall every session for 4 months, which is approximately 160 hours of sessions, and she had probably read the inscription many times over. I could not tell, from my angle, what her expression was while she looked at it, but I noted in my margins that she looked at it for the full 40 minutes the panel was absent, without moving and without speaking. I do not know what she saw there. I know what the inscription says. The Founding Compact's second article, which is the one that faces the treaty table most directly, reads, in the common trade language, all entities recognized before this commission are recognized in full, neither diminished by their past, nor constrained by others' accounts of it. It was there when the 43 volumes came out of the case. It was there every day of the 4 months of preliminary sessions. It had been there, presumably, for the full duration of humanity's engagement with the Commission. I recorded its existence in my margins. I did not record whether I thought Reeve had found it apt. That would have been editorial. When they returned, Velhen's composure was intact but had acquired a different quality. In my margin notes, I described it as structural rather than natural, meaning the composure was being maintained by deliberate architecture rather than by the absence of anything requiring management. I do not know if that distinction is legible to anyone but me. I recorded it because it was what I observed. He reopened the session. He stated for the record that the Commission was taking the introduced documents under formal advisement, that the materials would be assigned to a technical review panel, and that the day's session would proceed on the agenda, but that the Commission reserved the right to convene an extraordinary session pending the panel's findings. Reeves, of course. 2 words. She said nothing else. The formal review of the treaty text proceeded. I transcribed it. It was thorough and meticulous and entirely disconnected from what was actually occurring in the room, which was the collective intellectual labor of 11 species trying to reconcile a policy architecture built on an understanding of humanity that 43 volumes of documented evidence had just demonstrably revised. The Karath representative asked 3 questions about the monitoring protocol that he had not asked in any prior session. The Verath adjacent species delegation requested a clarification on the transit corridor language that they had previously accepted without objection. The Commission's own legal counsel offered 3 suggested amendments to the near-final text. Amendments that, in every case, reduced the asymmetry of the monitoring provisions. Reeve accepted each amendment without discussion. That, more than anything else in the session, is what I have returned to in the years since. The acceptance without discussion. She did not acknowledge that the amendments represented movement. She did not note that the Commission's counsel was revising language that his own office had defended as correct 48 hours earlier. She accepted each one with the same single-syllable affirmation, accepted, and waited for the next item. I am a clerk. I am trained to record, to interpret. But I have been recording long enough to know that the most legible thing a skilled negotiator can do, in a room that has just shifted on its foundation, is accept the other side's voluntary concessions as though they were entirely expected, which of course they were. By her, the day's session closed at the standard time. Velhen thanked the parties. He noted that the technical review panel would work through the evening and that the commission would advise parties of any scheduling adjustments by following morning. He was correct and formal and gave nothing away, which is exactly what a skilled chair does when he needs time to think. The human delegation gathered their materials. The technical advisor reclasped the black case. Empty now, the volumes remaining on the table as introduced documents, and they walked out together in a way that I can only describe as unhurried. Reeve was the last through the door, and she did not look back. I sat at my lectern and waited for the chamber to clear as my position requires. And then I recorded my margin notes for the final time that day, and in the space at the bottom of the right margin column, where I sometimes write, the thing that cannot be captured in procedural language, I wrote 3 words. They always knew. I stayed late to complete my initial transcription. The Commission's technical review panel was already assembled in the archive reading room, 2 floors below me, and I could see their lights from the window of my transcription office. They worked through the night, I was told later. Most of them. Several, I was also told, went home early. Not because they had finished, but because they had read enough and found that sufficient. The Commission issued no scheduling adjustment that evening. The following morning, before the session, I arrived at my station at the usual time and found that Velhen's senior counsel had already been in the chamber because her materials were arranged at her position in a manner that suggested overnight occupancy. She nodded to me when I entered. She had never done before. I did not know what the nod meant. I nodded back. The human delegation arrived at the scheduled time. 3 of them again. The same. 3. And Reeve sat down, hand open on the table in front of her, and waited. Velhen opened the session. He looked older than he had the previous day. I have been careful, in discussing this, not to over-dramatize that observation. He was already quite old, and a sleepless night accounts for a great deal. But I recorded it in my margins because it was what I saw, and I keep faith with what I see. He said that the Commission's technical review panel had conducted a preliminary assessment of the introduced materials. He said that the panel's preliminary finding was that the materials were substantively consistent, internally corroborated, and that the Commission had no grounds to question their authenticity. He said that in light of this finding, the Commission was withdrawing 3 provisions from the NIFR final treaty text for additional review, specifically the monitoring protocol framework, the corridor session language in Article 14, and the voting weight allocation in the supplementary annex. He said that a revised framework addressing these provisions would be circulated to all parties within 30 days. He said this in the measured language of institutional announcement, and when he finished, he looked at Reeve, and I believe he was waiting to see what she would do with the space he had just created. She looked at him for a moment. She nodded once. 3 days is acceptable, she said. That was the session. 12 minutes, beginning to end. I should describe what happened after, because the months following were not quiet, and an honest record requires it. Jeez. The technical review panel delivered its final findings at the 28-day mark. The internal distribution was restricted. But as a clerk of Third Register, I was required to transcribe the summary for the Commission's formal minutes, and I can say, without violating sensitivity protocols, that the panel's conclusions were unambiguous. Humanity's assessed capacity in 8 of the 12 documented domains was significantly greater than what the Commission's active archive entry described, and in 4 of those 8 domains the discrepancy was not marginal. The panel used a word I had not encountered in Commission technical reporting before. The word was systemic. The discrepancy was systemic, meaning it was not the result of errors or outdated assessments, but of information that had been available and had not been. The phrase the panel used was comprehensively incorporated. The Commission spent a great deal of time, in the weeks after the panel report, discussing how comprehensive non-incorporation of available information occurs. I was not party to those discussions, but I transcribed their formal outputs. And the formal outputs contained a great many words like analytical framework limitations and assessment, methodology review, and structural recalibration of intelligence protocols. And under all of those words, if you have spent enough years transcribing them, you can read the thing that is not said directly, which is, told ourselves a story about them, and then we used our own story as evidence. The Vareth Accord was renegotiated. It took 4 months. The final text was substantially different from the near-final text that had occupied the first session. The human delegation received both transit corridors outright, a governance stake in the joint use framework for the third, and a voting weight allocation of 8 rather than 5. The monitoring protocol was removed entirely in exchange for a mutual transparency mechanism that the Commission's counsel had originally proposed as a concession, and Reeve had then shaped, over 4 months of revision, into something considerably more favorable to the humans than the Commission had intended when it offered it. I transcribed every session. I was present for all of them. At my secondary lectern against the east wall, with my paper ledger and my margin columns, Reeve was present for all of them too. She looked the same in the final session as she had in the first. Hair pulled back, expression that was not, in fact, neutral. She spoke when she had something to say. She was silent when she did not. She never explained herself, never summarized her own positions for the benefit of parties who had understood them, never delivered the kind of ceremonial closing remarks that most senior delegations offer when a long negotiation concludes. When the final text was signed and Velen thanked the parties and closed the session, she gathered her copy of the document, stood, and walked out. Okuffer held the door for the technical advisor, who was carrying the black case again. It was empty. Hurt. He had picked it up from the Commission's document storage, where the 43 volumes were filed under their docket number, and he carried it out with him. I have never understood whether that was deliberate symbolism, or simply that he needed the case back, and I have decided it does not matter, because either way the room understood it as deliberate, which may be the only relevant fact. I have told this story, in various forms, to 3 commission review boards and 2 academic bodies that study galactic institutional history. I am always asked the same question at the end, which is some version of, when did they know? When did humanity understand that the Commission's assessment was wrong? And begin preparing accordingly? I do not know the answer. I have my suspicions, which I will offer, but I want to be honest that they are suspicions and not records. Suspicion is that the answer is contained somewhere in those 43 volumes, in the 17-year documentation period that the first volume's header entry specified. If the earliest documented evidence begins 17 years before the Vareth session, and if the preparation of the archive required work that began before the documentation period, then you are looking at something that was assembled over at least 2 decades. Possibly more. The Commission's active file had 11 revisions in 30 years of engagement. It is possible that the humans were working on their own revision for most of that time. What I do know, because I have the records, is that at no point in the Vareth negotiations, or in any of the 3 prior sessions where the treaty framework was being built, did the human delegation ever indicate that their documented capacity was different from what the Commission believed. They did not correct the record informally. They did not request revisions to the archive entry. They offered hints in the margins of their stated positions. Reeve negotiated for 4 months in the preliminary sessions with what appeared to be the full information picture the Commission had assembled, and she did it so cleanly that the Commission's senior strategists rated the preliminary outcome as favorable before the final session began. They were managing us. I say that with the precision the word deserves, and not with bitterness, because bitterness would require me to believe that something unfair had occurred. And nothing unfair had occurred. The Commission had an institutional habit of forming opinions about species, and then using those opinions as the basis for policy, and the human delegation had worked within that habit until the moment they chose not to, and they chose the moment with care. The Varith Accord mattered to them. The corridor access mattered. The voting weight mattered. They had tolerated the Commission's management framing for as long as it cost them a nothing critical, and, when it was about to cost them something critical, they placed 43 volumes on the table. I have thought about the weight of that decision. Not the political weight, the physical weight. I did not lift the volumes, I observed them. But I was told by the Commission's record staff who docketed them that the full archive ran to approximately 12,000 pages, and that the physical production of it, the printing, the binding, the organization into 43 cataloged volumes, had been done at a human production facility and transported to the Commission seat in the technical advisor's care. Case he had carried in on day 1 held only the case, hardware, and padding. The volumes had arrived separately, in Commission freight, 2 weeks before the session, logged under a trade goods manifest that the Commission's customs staff had cleared without examination because the manifest was correct and unremarkable, and because the Commission's staff clear hundreds of freight consignments a week. The technical advisor had known, when he walked into that chamber carrying an empty case, that the volumes were already in Commission storage waiting to be retrieved. I have no margin notation for that. I did not know it until months later, but when I learned it, I sat with it for a long time. And then I wrote it down in my personal record because I believed it belonged in an honest count. I served the Commission for 4 more years before I retired. In that time, Commission completed a full revision of Humanity's archive entry, not the 12th revision, but a comprehensive reconstitution, beginning with what the 43 volumes documented and working outward from there. I was assigned to assist the reconstitution team as a record-keeping consultant during the final 6 months of my service, and I read a great deal of material that I am not able to describe in detail, and I can say that the reconstitution team's lead assessor, a thorough and deeply experienced analyst named Mir Orvath, told me, in the last week I was there, that the revised standing classification had been the subject of considerable internal debate. The debate, as Orvath described it, had lasted 3 weeks and involved the Commission's 5 most senior archivists as well as 2 external consultants brought in specifically for the purpose. They had gone through every available classification framework and found each one insufficient in some meaningful way. Not insufficient for lack of data. The 43 volumes had given them more data than they had for most species, but insufficient for conceptual reach. The frameworks had been designed to classify known types of things, and they were encountering something that kept escaping the type. The first option they considered was a new formal classification, 13th tier above the existing 12. Orvath said they drafted the language for it 3 times and abandoned it each time because the language, however they wrote it, implied a boundary they could not honestly draw. A classification is a limit. It says, this thing exists within these parameters. And every time they tried to write the parameters, someone on the panel would read the volumes again and find something that argued against them. The second option was a provisional classification pending further assessment, which was standard procedure for newly encountered species whose profile was still being established. The problem, Orvath said, was that humanity was not newly encountered. Humanity had been in the Commission's files for 30 years. A provisional classification would require formally acknowledging that 30 years of engagement had produced an assessment less complete than a First contact entry, which was both accurate and institutionally uncomfortable. The third option was to collapse the classification framework entirely for humanity and replace it with a description, a prose account of what was known, without categorical assignment. This was theoretically possible under a rarely invoked variance clause. It required governing council approval, and the Commission's governing council, in Orvith's characterization, was not culturally disposed to prose. The fourth option was what they ultimately did. We left the standing classification field blank, he said. The system technically prohibits. We submitted a formal variance request to maintain the blank field pending further assessment. The variance was approved. He looked at me with the expression of a man who had spent his career assigning categories and had encountered, the first time, something he could not in good conscience categorize. It felt more accurate, he said. I understood. I recorded it. It is, I think, the most precise thing that the Joint Treaty Commission has ever officially recorded about humanity, that blank field. A formal, approved acknowledgement that what they knew was not sufficient to classify what they were looking at. Not a failure of information, not a gap to be filled. A considered institutional decision that the category did not yet exist, and that forcing a human answer into an alien box was worse than leaving the box empty. Reeve retired from the diplomatic service the same year I retired from the commission. I read the announcement in the Treaty Network's public bulletin. It was brief, her record, her years of service, a formal note of thanks from her government. There was a photograph. She was standing out some building I did not recognize, in a dark coat, hair still pulled back and now fully gray, and she was looking at whoever was taking the photograph with an expression that 31 years of margin note training could not parse into any professional category I possessed. She looked to me, someone who was exactly where she expected to be. I do not know what she knew, or when. I know what she placed on the table, and I know how she sat afterward while the room reorganized itself around the fact of it. I know she said 2 words when Velhen announced the withdrawal of the 3 provisions. 30 days is acceptable. And that was the only measure of response she gave to an event that restructured the Commission's approach to humanity for the decade that followed. I was a clerk. I kept records. I kept faith with what I observed, and I did not embellish, and I recorded the margins as well as the minutes. This is what the margins said. One delegation walked in one morning with 43 volumes of evidence that the most powerful administrative body in treaty space had spent 30 years not reading. They set it on the table. They waited. They accepted the consequences that followed, which were, to their satisfaction, entirely as expected. The Commission had a file for every species it had ever encountered. It turns out that what they had for humanity was the file humanity had written for them. I am retired now and I have time to think about this. And the thing I think about most is not the 43 volumes, or the blank classification field, or even the expression on Velhen's face during that second day. What I think about is the patience. 30 years of engagement, 4 months of preliminary negotiations, 160 hours of sessions, all managed within the Commission's framework, all conducted in a register that confirmed the Commission's preferred understanding. That patience is not something I can classify either. It is not strategic patience exactly, or not only that. It is something more like the patience of a body that understood, at some level, that it could wait. That waiting cost them something, probably, in the ordinary run of treaty terms and voting allocations, but that what it purchased was a moment they could choose, and that the choosing mattered enormously. I was a clerk. I kept records. I kept faith with what I observed, and I did not embellish, and I recorded the margins as well as the minutes. This is what the margins said. One delegation walked in one morning with 43 volumes of evidence that the most powerful administrative body in treaty space had spent 30 years not reading. They set it on the table, they waited, they accepted the consequences that followed, which were, to their satisfaction, entirely as expected.